All right, Isaiah 27. Let's call the next 4 chapters stuck, because it is going to go back to that concept that we saw, really going back to the Exodus from Egypt. That if you ask for something long enough, you might actually find that God will give it to you, only to learn that it's not what you really wanted in the first place. This, however, is going to build on that concept, understanding that once again, he is going to teach the children of Israel, or Judah at this point, that if you pretend you don't understand stuff long enough, you will get stuck without the wisdom to understand it. Going back to a quote that I remember from childhood, where we would occasionally hear, if you keep making that face, it'll get stuck in that shape, or it'll get stuck that way. Reminding me that, of course, in looking that up, there might have also been a SpongeBob episode called Face Freeze, where they had a competition to see who could keep a certain face the longest, only maybe building off of that principle to find that their faces got stuck that way. And so for the next 4 chapters, we're going to see different variations on how Judah became stuck in some bad habits they refused to let go of. So let's call chapter 27, Stuck Without Discernment. In this chapter that once again takes place over the course of 2 days, not 2 consecutive days, but 2 days, a day of peace and a day of cleansing. Understanding that the day of peace roughly begins and ends this chapter, as in the middle, he is going to talk about that day of cleansing. Understanding that in the first verse, in order to get to the day of peace, he is going to promise to slay the dragon Leviathan that lives in the seas, one referred to in past chapters, specifically Job, that when Job was challenging God to explain why he was going through it, God challenged him with some questions about things he couldn't understand. One of those being Leviathan, the great sea serpent that God now promises to slay. As he will go on in verse 2 to say, in that day, a pleasant vineyard, sing of it. I, the Lord, am its keeper. As he will go on to say that, as opposed to the days in chapter 5 that he mentioned where his vineyard was producing things that were completely unrelated to the things he was looking for, he is going to tend this vineyard and protect it night and day to keep it in a healthy condition. As he goes to verse 6 to say that in the days to come, Jacob shall take root and Israel shall blossom and put forth shoots and fill the whole world with fruit. This time, good fruit. And in order to get there, as we mentioned, he's going to spend the next few verses talking about the cleansing process that's going to take place over the course of that other day. But it's going to seem to take place in 2 ways. Verse 8, measure, by exile, he will contend with them, or it's going to say he contended with them. Something similar to what he's going to say in verse 12, where he says he is going to glean them one by one, the process by which it seems, my paraphrase, he will filter them for the impurities that will eventually be cleansed from the land for that second day, that day of peace. But he's not only going to filter them for their impurities, he's going to cleanse the land as well for some of the things that they have created in their impurities. Verse 9, he is going to seem to pound to dust the things that they used to set up the altars to their idols, or as we have called them, their images, the things they either gave credit or put their hope in for their prosperity or their future. As he will go on to talk about another familiar theme, the way in which the cleansing will leave the land deserted, essentially in verse 10, as he will go on in verse 11, the latter half of verse 11, to give us a why. For this people is without discernment, thus our title. Therefore, he who made them will not have compassion on them. He who formed them will show them no favor. As we have already mentioned, verse 12, we'll talk about the way in which to cleanse them of, the way in which they are lacking in discernment, among other things. He is going to glean them one by one. Going back to that conclusion we mentioned before, that there is a healthy point to all of this, and that is that second day, where it reads in verse 13, and in that day, a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. This chapter, once again, in that 2-day structure, offering a hope of peace far off. But in the meantime, talking about the cleansing, this time giving us additional insight on the cleansing helping us to understand that in contrast to other prophecies where he had compassion even on nations like Moab. This time, he is going to have no compassion for this component of his cleansing of his own people, Judah, which might seem like a harsh response to their lack of discernment until we see over the next few chapters the way in which they rejected discernment for so long that they got stuck lacking discernment.